Thanks for having me, guys. Pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Keith O'Brien. I'm a journalist and an author. I've written a number of books, and as you know, I've got a new book coming out here on March 26th, just about 5 weeks. It's called Charlie Hustle. It's about the rise and fall of Pete Rose and the last glory days of baseball. That's the subtitle of the book. And I mean, I think in a Zoom in particular on a subject that I think we probably all want to discuss. There's I'm not going to sit here and talk everybody's ear off tonight. What I thought I would do is just give you a little bit of the background, the backstory of the story. Talk to you a little bit about that, and then open it up for a fun baseball discussion about Pete Rose and about baseball in general. So I'm gonna share my screen here if I can and show you a couple things to get started, perhaps. Great, fantastic. Can you all see my screen now? Yeah,
Yep.
cool, great.
Yes.
So again, this is the book jacket. I'm really pleased with it. Again, because most of us here are baseball enthusiasts, baseball historians, baseball nerds, and I say that proudly. This photograph here is from the 1972 World Series, Reds against the Oakland A's, and that is Pete rounding second base at Riverfront Stadium in a play where he is trying to actually go for extra bases. Just a little bit about me. You can find me on all the usual channels. For some reason, my screen isn't moving. Hold on one second. Let's see here. My bad, guys. Hold on one second. Not super tech savvy with the zooms. I apologize. Let's see. For some reason, the screen's not advancing. Well, let's try it this way. Let's try again. Well, we'll try it this way. Apologize, guys. So you can find me on all the usual channels. I've got a website, keithob.com, and you can actually pre-order the book right now on the website. And in fact, you can get assigned books as well from my local independent bookseller here in New Hampshire. I'll circle back to more on that later. You can find me on all the usual social media platforms. I'm on Twitter here, or X, or whatever you want to call it these days. Of course, I'm on Facebook and also on Instagram. And I thought I'd start by just showing you some of my favorite photos that I dug up for the book. And this one is one of my favorites. This is Pete Rose, 1977. I actually found this photograph in Cincinnati Magazine from February 1977. Cincinnati Magazine sent a reporter and a photographer down to spring training to do a little feature on the Reds. And that is Pete Rose standing in front of old Al Lopez Field in Tampa. Of course, that's Joe Morgan in the background there. Can anybody name the third player there in the picture? Anybody got a guess? Throw it out.
George Foster.
George Foster's a great guess, and I will say that George Foster gets that all the time, but it's not George.
I was going to guess Ken Griffey, but I don't have very good eyes.
Yeah, good guess too. Griffey did have similar hair at the time. This is actually Mario Soto.
Oh.
Mario Soto, who at this time is really just fighting to make the big club. That's him, but he's got a lot of swagger there. I love everything about this photograph. I love that you can see Pete's tan line on his arms. I love his sort of scowl there as he looks at the camera. And I especially love that Pete is wearing a picture of himself on his own shirt, which is just perfect. Um, so I was thrilled to find this photograph and then to actually find the photographer. I was able to track him down. He still had the negatives, and I was able to license this photo for the book. I also love this photo here. This is Pete right around the same time. This is actually taken in October 1976, so about 4 months earlier. And it's really Pete at a high watermark of his career. This photo was taken just hours after the Reds had won the National League pennant in 1976. And the Reds had to wait around for a few days to see who they were going to play in the American League. And so what does Pete do on his day off? Well, he goes to one of his favorite places in the world. He goes to the racetrack in Kentucky, Keeneland Park in Kentucky, which some of you may have heard of. One of the things I love about the photo is just the detail, and in particular, the bracelet he's wearing on his right wrist there down in the corner. You see it's a gold bracelet emblazoned with jewels that spell out his name, P-E-T-E. Again, just love this photo here. And then, of course, we all know who these guys are. Sparky, Pete. This is earlier 1970s in the dugout. And, Sparky in this photo is just 40 years old. Of course, he looks already like he's 60, but he's about 40 years old. And, Sparky loved Pete Rose. And that's notable for a reason I'll get to in a moment. But his love for Pete was instant. Within literally hours of Sparky being named manager of the Reds in December 1969, he appoints Pete Rose, a man he has barely met, to be the captain of the Reds. And this was for Sparky an easy decision to make, he would say, but it was somewhat controversial for fans. In 1969, 1970, or even into the early 1970s, many Cincinnati Reds fans thought Johnny Bench should have been the captain, a much younger man who was different from Pete in a lot of ways. But Sparky always had an affinity for Pete. And that affinity was important, I think, not just, for Pete being named captain, but because by the time this photo was taken right here, Pete was already betting on sports with bookies. And by the mid 1970s, this practice of Pete's would be well known in the Cincinnati clubhouse, but no one did anything to stop it, which again, I think is an important precursor for things to come. So that's a little bit about my favorite photos. I'm gonna stop the share here just so you can see me now, and I'll talk a little bit about the book. I'm in the time I have, I'm just gonna talk about, why Pete, why now, why this book? So I guess for starters, why Pete? I think even among baseball fans, Pete has lived for so long that we have forgotten why we ever really loved him in the first place. And the fact is, love him or hate him, Pete Rose was an American icon. You simply cannot write the story of baseball or the history of baseball in the 20th century without Pete Rose. He is a fundamental character to that story, who seems to find himself at the center of so many critical moments, both on and off the field, in the 30 years he's in professional baseball, from 1960 to 1989. Obviously, many of us remember or know those moments. You've got the collision at home plate, All-Star Game 1970 with Ray Fosse. A memorable moment because of how that game ends, but memorable too because that game was the most watched All-Star game in Major League Baseball history up until that moment. 50 million people tuned in to watch that All-Star game. And obviously Riverfront Stadium, where the game was held, was sold out. And who's sitting right behind home plate but Richard Nixon, President Richard Nixon. And that in and of itself isn't that notable. Presidents come to All-Star games all the time and throw out the first pitch, and Nixon did do that. But then what is notable is Nixon stays. He is there until the end of the game, and is there when Pete Rose barrels into Ray Fosse to end it. So you've got that. You've got the epic fight with Bud Harrelson at second base in the 1973 National League playoffs. You've got, of course, the great 1975 World Series, followed by the 76 World Series, followed by Pete Rose's quest to take down Joe DiMaggio's hit record in 1978, which he falls short of by 12 games. And all of this comes even before, the ultimate hit record, which he topples in 1985. But to me, what's most interesting is it wasn't even about the hits or the World Series rings. That wasn't why people loved him. People loved Pete Rose because of how hard he worked. And that was real. But it was also, sort of inflated by the press. I mentioned before, Sparky Anderson loved Pete Rose. So too did the press. The baseball writers in the 1960s and 70s absolutely loved Pete Rose. And there were a few reasons for that. One reason is that Pete was accessible. He was happy to talk to them, unlike some players at the time. And multiple columnists would say at the time that if they went to Pete Rose's locker after a game or on an off day, he would give them 3 different columns, for the week. He could fill their columns for the week. And so they did love him for that reason. But another reason, and maybe more subtle reason why I think Pete was beloved by the press, is that he was a lot like them. Remember, women weren't allowed in major league locker rooms as reporters until 1979. So the press corps is all male. It's almost entirely all white. He reminds the reporters of themselves, of their own fathers, of their own brothers, of their own childhoods. He is them. And so, Pete Rose, really wins over the press corps, who helps tell the story, really, of Charlie Hustle, including even that nickname, which is the title of my book. Some of you may know, that nickname was coined by Whitey Ford and Mickey Mantle. And it was coined at spring training 1963 in a game at Al Lopez Field in Tampa. The Yankees were playing the Reds. It was a massive game because the Yankees were at the peak of their power and fame. And this game is going to be carried live on television in New York and Ohio, a spring training game. Sold out at Al Lopez Field. And Pete Rose, who is fighting for a spot on the big league roster, plays so hard that day that Mickey Mantle finds it absurd. And that nickname that he gives him, Charlie Hustle, was actually intended to be an insult. Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford thought that Pete Rose, this young kid with a flat top haircut, was working too hard, playing too hard. And so they were really mocking him with this nickname. But in a classic Pete Rose pivot, he spins it in his favor. And that whole spring and summer, after he makes the big league roster, Pete Rose tells anyone who will listen, any reporter who will listen, that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle. And he just kept telling the story until people believed that it was actually a compliment. But back to the work ethic and the way he played on the field, just to put it in perspective. You know, he, this effort that he put out was shocking even at the time, and that is something, because back in these days, until the mid to late 1970s, no player had a multi-year contract. Everybody's playing on a 1-year deal. Everybody. So everybody's fighting for the next year's salary. And so the fact that Pete was playing so hard at a time when guys were playing hard, I think is notable. We wouldn't even know what to do with Pete Rose on a field today. It would be like he was dropped in from outer space. So with the book, I've really tried to go back and tell that story. Tell that rise that Pete Rose has, because remember, as fans, as readers, we only care about someone's fall if we ever cared about them in the first place. And so one thing I really try to do with the book is to go back and reconstruct the world that Pete Rose lived in, this unpolished world of baseball where guys would fight each other at second base, where guys were fighting for the next year's salary, and reconstruct that rise. But of course, in this time where Pete is rising, he is, as I said before, already gambling with bookies in Cincinnati. And these misdeeds by the mid 1970s are well known in the Cincinnati clubhouse. At the 1975 World Series, I unearthed a story for my book that Johnny Bench found Kurt Gowdy, the NBC announcer, the famous NBC announcer, on the field at Fenway Park before one of those World Series games. And Johnny explained to Kurt that he hoped that Kurt would have a conversation with Pete, because in Johnny's estimation, Pete was hanging around with bad guys. Now, who those guys were, I don't know, in Johnny's estimation. But I can speculate. Even at that 1975 World Series, Pete is traveling with a man named Mario Nunez, who was a well-known figure in the gambling circles in the Tampa Bay area. And so Mario Nunez is in the clubhouse during the playoffs, 1975. He's traveling with the team. He's staying at Pete Rose's house. And this unraveling for Pete really does continue. And my reporting shows that in 1978, sometime in the spring of 78, just before Pete began his hit streak that nearly took down DiMaggio's record, Major League Baseball dispatched at least one person, a high-level person, to come to Cincinnati and have a meeting with Pete Rose in Dick Wagner's office, Dick Wagner, the president of the Cincinnati Reds, in which they discussed Pete's gambling and his debts. And so as early as 1978, Major League Baseball is aware of Pete's gambling. They're aware of his debts. And yet it would be 11 more years until these problems made headlines. February 1989, until they made headlines. And one reason why I do believe they make headlines then is that the world has now changed. Baseball has changed. This world that Pete had grown up in, come of age in, unpolished world filled with unpolished characters, was now $1 billion sport, covered by CNN and ESPN, and in this new world, this new $1 billion world, Major League Baseball could no longer tolerate Pete Rose's misdeeds in the shadows, and he is going to go down. So the world changed, and I would submit that the world has changed again. I mean, as we all know, as sports fans, you can't watch a game now these days without seeing the gambling advertisements. And it's legal now in most states I believe 34 states legal. And many of those states you can bet on your phones. And in most of those states, you can do it at the stadium. And, last year in America, we legally wagered over $100 billion on sports. That's a new record, shattering the previous record set in 2022. And just for perspective, $100 billion. If we had pooled that money instead of betting that money, if we had collectively pooled that $100 billion, we could have bought every single Major League Baseball team and still had about $30 billion to play around with. So we're gambling like never before. We saw it last year. We're seeing it right now, setting new records really at every major sporting event. Just 2 weeks ago at the Super Bowl, Americans legally bet about $20 billion on a single game, on a single day. And we're already on track to break our annual record this year. So what better time to revisit the story of one of our most notorious gamblers than now? And then finally, why this book? Again, we're all baseball fans here. We know in broad strokes the Pete Rose story. But I do believe that it's never been told like it is told in this book. I got unprecedented access to Pete Rose and his inner circle. I interviewed Pete Rose for 27 hours for this book until he stopped calling me back, until he shut down. But with that access, I was able to speak with a great many people who have never talked before. I've interviewed 3 different men who placed Pete's bets on baseball. 2 former commissioners of baseball, John Dowd, the former special counsel of Major League Baseball, and his entire investigative team who unraveled Pete's lies in 1989. Pete Rose's children, ex-wives, ex-mistresses. I have interviewed as many people as I could get to. And what I've really tried to do here is look at Pete Rose's story through the prism of history, tell that story through that reporting, and then let people come to their own conclusions, which I think is another way this book is unique. I'm not putting my opinions in this book. I'm not taking sides. What I've really tried to do is look at one of our most complicated and fascinating sports figures of the 20th century, tell that story, and let people make up their own minds about it. Of course, in conclusion here, for at least my prepared remarks, one of the questions I know we're going to talk about tonight is Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame. And so I guess I just want to address that, right off the top. And I want to say that, I am not here to fight Pete Rose's battles for him. He has made a lot of poor decisions as a grown adult man. And I think at this point, he has to live with those decisions. Also interesting to me is I just don't really think it's that relevant of a debate, the Pete Rose piece of it. And by that, I mean, the argument about Pete getting in the Hall of Fame is a hypothetical argument built on a mountain of hypotheticals. He is not on the ballot at Cooperstown. He is not going to be on the ballot at Cooperstown anytime soon. I think he's not going to even be considered while he's still alive. And I think Pete himself knows that, which is why if you follow him, you'll see that, in the last few years, he, goes and christens new casinos. He places the first bet at sports books, brand new sports books. He appears on gambling podcasts. This is not the behavior of someone who's trying to curry favor with Rob Manfred and Major League Baseball. This is the behavior of someone who's living the life he wants, and is no longer worrying, for better or for worse, no longer worrying about what people might think of him. To me, the more interesting debate is about how we celebrate athletes in general. Are we celebrating them for the lives that they've lived, or are we celebrating them for the art they've created? And this bigger philosophical question is one that actually Bart Giamatti, the former commissioner of baseball, identified on the very day that Pete was banned in August 1989. On that day, Bart held a massive press conference in New York City at the Hilton in Midtown, and for that press conference, which was carried live, by the way, on every network, CNN, ESPN, Bart came out and gave a very short statement, a very short but poetic statement. And then he took questions from a teeming crowd of reporters for almost an hour on live television. And I just want to stop there for a second, because you cannot imagine a league commissioner of any sport doing that today. On live TV in front of 200 reporters taking questions. It would not happen. Bart does it, and it's masterful. Again, the investigation into Pete Rose has its flaws and mistakes along the way, but that day in New York, it is a master class in crisis management. And during the question and answer, a reporter asks Bart Giamatti, what are we to do with Pete Rose when he appears on the ballot 2 years later? Which he was going to, by the way. There was no rule in Cooperstown that barred him from the Hall of Fame. That rule that bars Pete from the Hall of Fame wouldn't be adopted until 1991, about 10 months before Pete's name would have appeared on the ballot. And so on the day he's banned, reporters are already asking, how are we going to handle his candidacy for the Hall when he comes up? And Bart answers by saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he will do nothing to influence their votes. He will do nothing to take his name off the ballot. And that he said he looked forward to seeing how reporters judged life and art and weighed the two. And, I think that's a very nuanced conversation. I don't think it's black and white. But I will say historically, baseball writers and voters only looked at one thing. They were looking primarily at the art. In that first vote, first Hall of Fame class, 1936, Ty Cobb receives the most votes. For the next 50 years, roughly, there is very little debate about any player's moral character. It is really about their performance on the field. And it's only in the 1980s, really, that starts to change. In the 1980s, baseball writers start to wrestle with players' off-field problems. Players who were caught up in the cocaine scandals of the 70s and 80s pay a price for that. Ferguson Jenkins doesn't get in for a long time, almost assuredly because of his connections with cocaine. Dave Parker, I think, pays a price for his cocaine off the field. And players, too, start to pay a price for how nice they were to reporters. Remember, one thing that was often said about Jim Rice in the years when he was not in the Hall of Fame was that, he just wasn't very nice to the media. These things simply did not matter back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s when players were voted in at that time. And one reason why, in my opinion, is just that getting into the Hall of Fame wasn't as big of a deal back then. The crowds were smaller. The players themselves gave no speeches. When they did start to give speeches, they were really short. Ted Williams speaks at his induction in 1966 for about 6 minutes. Um, that's all changed now. If anyone's been to the Hall of Fame inductions in recent years, especially when some of the big popular names have been inducted, the crowds are over 100,000 people. They've had to move them off site many decades ago now to a large complex, whereas they used to have them right there at the hall. And when players are inducted these days, they don't talk for 6 minutes like Ted Williams did. They talk about themselves for 30 minutes or longer. And I would submit that, if this is how we're going to honor our athletes, giving them that kind of praise and adulation, then almost no one is worthy of the Hall of Fame. Certainly not someone who has lied about his misdeeds for decades. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions. Any thoughts you all might have? I see there's some comments in the chat, but if anyone wants to start us off, I'd be happy to have a conversation. Yeah, Mark, go ahead. I see your hand is up.
Great talk. I'm so excited to read this book, and thank you for being here. I'm actually crashing the party from New Jersey. Awesome. Not a member of the Central Illinois chapter. I'm a member of Goose Goslin in South Jersey. So
cool.
Hello from the East Coast. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, in these, now that we have analytics and that we've shifted our view of what counts as a good baseball player, do Pete Rose's records and his career hold the same resonance? I mean, to be the all-time hits leader, that's not something that, we look at. I mean, that's of course a signature achievement that I think would always, in other circumstances, get somebody into the Hall of Fame. But if you look at him compared to other Hall of Famers in terms of, productivity and value compared to other position players like he's a Hall of Famer, but he's not an inner circle Hall of Famer, right? So why go through the trouble here? What makes him, aside from the aura of these records, do we see him now as a different kind of player?
Yeah, great question. So let me be completely upfront, because we're all SABR members here and we're all, baseball enthusiasts. I don't purport to, be an expert on statistical analysis. A lot of the new metrics, were developed long after my boyhood days and early 20s when I was crunching the numbers. That said, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you go and look at Pete's WAR, for example, it isn't top notch. I think he ranks around 70 something, if I'm recalling correctly, all time. And yeah, the analytics of recent years would suggest that punching a single through the gap between first and second isn't the best way to handle your at bat. You're one of your 4 chances at the plate. So I think all that is true. To get to the second half of your question, is it worth the trouble? I think that's where we get to the cultural significance that Pete Rose once held here. And again, I think one of the things I've tried to do with my book is recapture that for whatever it's worth. Because again, the only reason why we're talking about Pete Rose now, or that we care to debate it, is because he once was on this sort of Mount Rushmore of players. And again, I think, as you'll see in the book, a lot of that was real, but a lot of that was mythology and created by the beat writers who loved him. But I will say this, Al Michaels, was the Reds play-by-play guy in the early 1970s before he went to the Giants and then obviously went on to bigger things. And, Al Michaels, as a young broadcaster, said that he had never seen anyone like him. And I think there is something to that. Again, he didn't fit in the game even then when players were playing so hard. I'll tell one anecdote about that that was relayed to me on a couple different occasions. Multiple pitchers told me that Pete Rose was harder to get out when he had 2 strikes than when he had none. Bill Lee, the spaceman, told me that. Bill obviously faced him in the World Series 1975. He also faced him for many years when he was with the Expos later, and Pete was with the Phillies and Reds. And Nolan Ryan said the same thing, that no one was relaxed when they got 2 strikes on Pete because Pete would bear down. He would bear down. But to your point, Mark, at that point, he's not looking to hit a double in the gap. He's looking to punch a mistake through the hole and get on base. But that mentality, not to die, not to go down, does make him a success on the field, whether it's inner circle all-timer or just, Hall of Famer. It makes him a success on the field. But interestingly to me, that same mentality, refuse to die, refuse to give anyone anything, refuse to be vulnerable, is the same reasons why he unravels off the field. Yes, Sean, I see you've got your hand up.
Oh, hey, Jason, you want to go first? I know you.
Oh, Jason, yeah, whoever, yeah, go ahead. I think you're muted, Jason.
You're right. Yeah, Keith, I was going to say, good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too, man.
At the Matheny chapter. So this is just a commercial plug, because I don't know if Keith's going to do it, but he gave me a link to the independent bookstore in his backyard that sells the book with free shipping and free autograph. And you can put a little note how you want it personalized. So I'm going to just drop the link in the chat. That's it, because I think he's
you're
awesome.
The best, Jason. Thank you, man. Good to see you again.
Okay.
Good to see you.
Good deal. All right, take care.
Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious how you went about reaching out to Pete, and if he thought maybe he was going to get a say in the final book or anything, or did he, or how'd that all kind of work out?
Yeah, great questions all. Again, especially because I know a lot of us in SABR, like to write, like to do research, and would like to interview players. So I'll take your questions in order. So I'm from Cincinnati originally, born and raised. I was born on the west side of Cincinnati, which is the part of town Pete was from, and ultimately moved to the east side. My parents still live there. Anyone who knows most mid-sized Midwestern towns knows that even the big towns are small towns, and Cincinnati is one of those towns. And so when I set out to do the book, I started by just doing interviews with people I could reach, people who would call me back, often local guys who I knew were still friends with Pete. And I was very transparent, that I wanted to tell the whole story here. The story of the rise and fall, because I feel like that's the only way you can tell Pete Rose's story. I feel like, a number of books have really focused on the fall, on the gambling, on the bad part. Pete Rose's books, of course, his own memoirs, have focused more on the self-serving parts. I really wanted to tell the historical story. So, long story short, I met some of those guys. I received an introduction from Pete from one of those guys, one of his good friends, and that's how we began talking. And no, at no time did I promise, or would I ever promise, to let the source of the subject of the book read the book. I mean, this is a work of history, a work of journalism. Pete knew that. And it is probably why he did stop calling me back. I don't know why, though, to be completely honest. We never had a falling out. We never had a problem. The last time I saw Pete seemed like things were good. And we were talking about when I should come back to Las Vegas to interview him in person again. So I can only speculate as to why he stopped calling. I think ultimately, I pushed Pete. I asked hard questions, and I think I pushed him as far as he could go. Yeah, Tom, you get your hand up.
Kind of two parts here. Some years ago, we went to the Cincinnati Reds Museum, and what struck me the most was that wall with all the baseballs. And then just about a year or so ago, I was at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And I'll have to admit at the time, I didn't really think about it a lot. But now with this book coming out, think about it. Did I see anything in the Hall of Fame? Even though he's not in the Hall, there's artifacts, there's things in the Hall of Fame that are not someone who's in the Hall itself that relate to Pete Rose. Do you know, are there artifacts in the Hall of Fame that belong to Rose? Undoubtedly, there's some things that they asked for, balls, whatever it is along the way, but maybe we're not seeing or not going to be put on display. What's your take on this?
Yeah, there are dozens of artifacts at Cooperstown that are connected to Pete or belong to Pete or moments in his career. There is, in my recollection, a couple of small places where he's featured. I believe on that wing of the museum where some of the steroid guys are featured. Pete, there's a small panel in there about Pete. So he's in there. Again, now we're getting into the weeds on this Hall of Fame debate, but there is, I think, a distinction between having your items in there and having your bust there. Obviously, those are two different things. And then where you fall on this really depends on how you see the Hall of Fame and, how you answer that question about life and art. Do you see the Hall of Fame as a museum or as a place where people are enshrined? These are the elements. And interestingly, in every interview I did, especially with ball players, former ball players, I would ask the questions at the end, the big questions. Do you think Pete should be in the Hall? And it was a mix. Some guys told me, yes, absolutely. He was one of the best there ever was. He should be in there. Other guys said point blank, if it were me who had been caught betting on my team, no one would be even discussing me right now. I wouldn't be in the Hall and nobody would be carrying the torch for me. Also true. Terry Francona is a person I interviewed. He was still with the Guardians at the time. And I interviewed Terry because Terry was there in Montreal in that 1 year where Pete was there, that abbreviated sort of, truncated failed year in Montreal before he gets traded back to Cincinnati. And I wanted to try to reach as many people as I could who were on that Expos team. And Terry was there, but he also comes and plays with the Reds later in the 1980s. So he plays a couple seasons with Pete. And as we all know, Terry is now like an elder statesman of baseball. And so when I asked Terry the question, I got a different answer. And Terry's take was he believes that all the players, and he meant the steroid guys too, should be voted into the Hall if what they did on the field was enough. And then he said the Hall of Fame should put it on their plaques. If their misdeeds were so terrible, they should go on the plaque, in Terry's opinion. And, I think that's an interesting argument, but I think it's another thing that will never happen. Again, we've turned induction day into almost a coronation. And at a coronation, you don't want two lines on a bronze plaque that said, bet on the game and was banned for 40 years, or was one of the most productive hitters of the 1980s and 90s, and then began taking HGH and steroids and broke all the records. It's a nice idea, but another thing that's just not going to happen, in my opinion.
I had one more thought real quick.
Yeah.
My dad, following baseball as I was in the 1960s, he greatly admired Pete Rose. But your comment you made just a moment ago is exactly kind of where he is. He said, but it's really hard to forgive what he did. And he was one of the greatest ball players ever. But he just thought he tainted the game. He tainted it for himself. He tainted it for a lot of other people. And he can't forgive him. But he still thinks he was one of the greatest ever. But that nuance between, should be or shouldn't be is the way he leaves it. That's what it is.
Yeah. And what's sad to me and about the story is it didn't have to go down this way. And the reporting makes it clear. My reporting makes it clear to again, Pete's gambling was well known to Major League Baseball for at least a decade. And they sort of monitored it or abided it. And it's only when Sports Illustrated gets a tip from another Cincinnatian who had been excommunicated from Pete Rose's circle that Pete was betting on baseball and was betting on the Reds. It's only when Sports Illustrated starts to dig into this tip and the rumor floats across town in New York to the offices of Major League Baseball that Peter Ueberroth, Bart Giamatti, and Fay Vincent decide to call Pete Rose to New York for a meeting in which they can ask him some hard questions about whether or not this is true. And this is, late February 1989. Peter Ueberroth has 1 foot out the door. He is leaving his post in 5 weeks, and Bart Giamatti is taking over. Fay Vincent has already been brought in to be Bart's number 2. And so it's a transitional moment. And my reporting shows that if Pete comes to that meeting in a conference room adjacent to Peter Ueberroth's office with Fay, Bart, Peter, and Pete and his lawyers, and tells the truth, everything's different. Every single thing. Again, one thing we've forgotten in the last 35 years as Pete Rose has sort of become a caricature of his former self is that he was actually beloved in 1989. And he was good for baseball in 1989. And so Peter Ueberroth didn't want to saddle Bart Giamatti with this scandal. Bart Giamatti certainly didn't want to start his tenure with this scandal. If Pete is honest in the room that day, tells them, yes, I've bet on baseball, I've bet on the Reds, I have a problem, I need help, everything's different. But again, getting back to something I said earlier during Mark's question, Pete can't be vulnerable. He can't be weak. This ability he had to always believe that things were going to work out, that he would not strike out, he would get a hit, he would win the game, he would overcome, is the same reasons why he can't be honest in the room that day. And we all know what happens next. What do you guys think? Do you guys have where do you fall on the whole Pete Rose debate? I'm curious.
I think he gets in right after Joe Jackson.
I think it's good for him that he's not in, because if he got in, I don't know if we'd be talking about him. It's kind of like back to Joe Jackson. We still talk about him because he's not in. It's like a tragedy. But I don't know. I'm really looking forward to reading the book because I don't really like Pete Rose, but it's a really interesting. He's an interesting character.
Keith, did you tell us any stories that aren't in the book? Well, I'm asking if you did because I want to know if I need to retain my notes or if I'll get to read these. That's why I'm asking.
Did I tell you any stories so far that aren't in the book?
Yeah.
I have it in broad strokes. I mean, not everything I've said is in the book.
Okay.
I did over 150 hours of interviews for the book. So there's a lot left on the cutting room floor here. You know, when you're trying to just tell a story, a narrative, you know, you're just looking for scenes and moments that drive the story along. So there were a lot of things that, you know, ultimately didn't get included, that, you know, were just, you know, sort of amazing little nuggets or amazing little moments. Yeah, Mark, you had your hand up.
This is fabulous, by the way. Congrats on the book again.
Thank you.
A question I'd just love to hear your thoughts about. One thing you mentioned earlier was how Rose appealed to the media by being like them. And, you know, 60s to 70s, huge time of baseball transition, social upheaval. How much of Rose's appeal do you think was baked into kind of his whiteness, right? Like how much of this was Pete being kind of like a symbol of baseball from an older time, you know, pre-integration perhaps, or just recalling a certain kind of narrative about baseball in the midst of this time of change. And just to give credit, you know, I read this great biography about Roberto Clemente, and I'm blanking on the author's name just now, but Rose is mentioned just as an aside almost as sort of a contrasting figure to Clemente in terms of how he was regarded in the public eye at the time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And did that come up in your interviews, your discussions with people at all, or your readings?
Yeah. So it's actually, again, my story here is a human narrative, you know, so I'm not beating anybody over the head with any sort of, you know, academic sort of arguments. However, you know, one thing I try to do with any book is sort of capture the time that someone is living in, capture that moment, because you're living in the moment, right? We right now are a reflection of our moment. And so, yes, to your question, again, 1960, when Pete signed with Geneva as a rookie on a $7,000 deal, baseball is still very white. The all-star teams, go look at them. They're very white. It is only later that this begins to change, and it's happening at the time that Pete is becoming a star. And there's a moment in the late 1960s where on the National League side, suddenly most of the starters are not white. And the American League is lagging behind a little bit, but even they are now more diverse. And in this moment, late 1960s, Pete has now won back-to-back batting titles. You know, he's beaten Matty Alou, and then he's beaten Roberto Clemente going down to the final days of the season. He wants a big contract, Pete does. He's never, you know, made six figures. He wants $100,000 deal. And in this moment, late 1960s, as this diversification is happening, Pete actually tells the media, I'm the best white star you've got. And when the quote hits the papers, Pete distances himself from it and says, no, I didn't say that. But the column ran in one of the Cincinnati papers from one of these, you know, guys who knew him well. And when the quote appeared, a different columnist for a paper down in Tampa who covered Pete a lot at spring training wrote that, you know, he may be distancing himself from that comment, but it sure sounds a lot like Pete. And again, Pete was tapping into an unsettled feeling that a lot of fans had, you know, at that time as baseball became more diverse. You know, but this was something of a theme with Pete. You know, a decade later, so now we're late 1970s. Pete is now, you know, one of the highest paid stars in baseball. You know, with the Phillies. He's about to start the 1979 season. He's left the Reds, and he gives access to a female reporter from Playboy magazine to do the Playboy interview. This again, we're, you know, back in this time, as some of us may remember, the Playboy interview was one of the most culturally important media pieces of every month. And so, of course, he accepts to be the subject of the Playboy interview, and he gives access to this young female reporter who I did, by the way, interview. Her name is Samantha Stevenson. She's still alive today. And in this interview, Pete makes a comment, and I'm gonna have to paraphrase it here because I'm not looking at it exactly. But Samantha Stevenson asks him about race in baseball, and in particular asks him about prominent athletes who are black or white. And Pete says, and again I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quote is in the book. He says, well, who would Swanson's Pizza rather have as its spokesperson, chomping down on a piece of pizza? Would you want me or would you want Dave Parker? So, the racial undertones, I think are real, at that time. And the last thing I'll say about it is this, the way Pete played on the field was celebrated, and it worked for him. But I have a hard time imagining in 1970 or 1973, a young black athlete, barreling into Bud Harrelson at second base, or barreling into Ray Fosse at home plate, and not paying a real price for it. Yeah, Tom, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, a couple of things here. One, going back to the way I think I told you about my father, Philip, I'd give him the characteristic of a Joe Lunchbox. I think that's what appealed people in that era to Pete Rose. Before he was making millions and obviously making a great deal of money, he might piss people off, but he did what needed to be taken care of. And in that era too, I'd kind of say, my dad was a union member and things, standing up to authority and stuff, that appealed to people in that way. And then the other issue I was going to bring up is when I've talked to friends about this, the question comes up, who's going to be in the Hall of Fame first, Barry Bonds or Pete Rose? I think a lot more people that I know when I talk about are more and more willing to let Shoeless Joe get in. There's a nostalgic element to that, whether it's from Field of Dreams or a lot of other things. They'd let him in. But then that becomes, as I've heard from some people, an interesting question to ask, does that become a racial issue? They don't let Barry Bonds in, but they let Pete Rose in, is because he's white and Bonds is black. My opinion of the whole thing is, I don't think either one ought to be in, but I know some people on some of the websites that are just chomping at the bit to get Barry Bonds in. And I don't think it's because they want Rose in, but they want Bonds in for a variety of reasons. But that dichotomy there between, who created the greater sin? Breaking the home run record, and we know it's on steroids. I've got a video that I recorded a ball game between, I think, the Cardinals and the Pirates, and I don't remember what the year was. And I went back and looked at it one day, and I thought, oh my God, who is that kid out there playing? And then you see him in that last year. There's no way in the world you can think that he did something. But that's an issue that I've heard people discuss.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. If we go down the steroid rabbit hole, we're going to be down there all night. It's just, that is the endless debate, right? And we can go all night on it. For me, both sins are hard to forgive. What I think ultimately hurt the game more, if I had to answer, for me, it's the steroids, and I'll say why. I think you can draw a straight line from the late 1990s to the rule changes that were made last year, because as the steroid guys, as players realized, if I take steroids and HGH, I can hit more home runs and I can get paid more money, and then everybody starts swinging more for the fences, and then the analytics come in telling people, actually, that's not a bad plan, et cetera, et cetera. Suddenly, the game that we grew up watching with action and movement and hits and stolen bases has been replaced by a game with rapidly declining batting averages, a lot more downtime, waiting for guys to strike out or hit home runs. I think you can draw a straight line from those early steroid players to the rule changes last year. And so for me, the steroid guys just fundamentally changed the game without question.
I apologize, I keep popping in.
No, please,
There are
yeah.
a lot of famous examples of people betting on baseball and staying in the game. John McGraw, sort of maybe most famously, bet a ton. Was this ever something that came up in the discussions of how to deal with Rose at the time? These examples of people who had actually done pretty much the same thing and were honored nonetheless.
Yeah, Leo DeRocher, also, by the way, Hall of Famer now. Denny McLain was suspended, actually, I think on this day in 1970. That suspension only lasted, I think, 90 days. I think the other thing we have to think about, and when we talk about place and time and context, is what America was like in 1989. We're coming off 8 years of Reagan. This is, we are the white, shining city on the hill. It was a very conservative time. It was a very puritanical time, and Bart Giamatti comes into office, with the highest of ideals, and I have a ton of respect for Bart Giamatti. It is one of the great tragedies, I think, for baseball that he did not really get to be commissioner, that the Pete Rose scandal swallowed his entire time in office. But, in this time, faced with someone who was just lying to their face, what do? They hire a man who was highly overqualified to pursue the lies of a poorly educated baseball player who did not do a very good job of hiding his skeletons. John Dowd had exposed the corruption of congressmen and mobsters. I'm talking about real mobsters in the Justice Department. It took John Dowd and a small team of investigators about 8 weeks to unravel roughly 15 years of lies. It's stunning, really. And, again, going back to the summer of 1989, because Pete was so adamant that they were wrong and that they had it wrong, opinions actually split in America. 65% of Americans think maybe Pete bet on baseball. 35% say no. And they believe Pete. Casting doubts on the Dowd report. But you go back and you look at the Dowd report now. And by the way, you can find most of it online. This report was 3,000 pages long, including exhibits and depositions. And what's stunning about it is, as a first draft of history, it is remarkably accurate. They absolutely had the goods on them at that time. And I think because Pete was so adamant that they had it wrong, they only had one thing they could do, which was drop the hammer and ban him. Well, you guys have had great questions tonight. I just really enjoyed the conversation. I'm happy to stay and talk. But I just want to say thanks for having me. Like I said, you can find my the pre-order links on my website. Jason was so nice to mention. There is the signed copies available here at my local bookstore. I will go in there as soon as the books come in, probably in about 3 weeks, start signing, and those books will ship and arrive by magic on the day of publication. You'll get it on the same day. And I will say, if anyone does pre-order, send me an email. and I will send you your own Charlie Hustle bookmark with that favorite photo I showed you earlier, and you can read all your books with your own Pete Rose bookmark, which I think as baseball fans, we can just enjoy no matter what we're reading.
Did your reporting show that was Jack and Coke in his glass too, or did you not get that far?
Actually, in one of the Life's Great Dichotomies, Pete Rose doesn't drink.
Oh, okay.
He does not drink. So that was probably just Coke.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. The book is the one at the waterstreetbook.com site. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have links posted on Facebook and Twitter and in the email as well. So you should have it there, Tom.
And seriously, drop me an email. I'll send you a bookmark. Or if you purchase through Water Street on the day when I go in and sign, I'll just slide a bookmark right in that book for you, and it'll arrive with your own bookmark in your book. And I'll, like Jason said, just note in the sales form how you want it personalized or to whom, and I'll write something fun and cool in there for you.
That's great.
Awesome. And if you want to meet Keith, he'll be in Winnetka here in Illinois in April.
I will.
Up at the book stall.
Yep. Yeah. Unfortunately, not making it down to Central Illinois, but I'll be up there in Winnetka.
There's a lot more rich people in Winnetka than there is in Central Illinois.
Yeah, Winnetka is a little high, a little might be too elite for me. I don't know if I'll get in, but I'll do my best.
You charge extra for those autographs.
Right. And the books.
And the books.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Keith. We really appreciate it.
Thank you guys. Such a great talk. Loved the questions. Loved the conversation. It was so much fun. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome,
Thanks,
guys.
Paul.
Have a great night.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice job putting that together.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Cool. Take care, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
See you.